Hello, my name is Johan Peter Paludan, and I'm going to talk a bit about big data and the future. And I'm going to do this by starting with talking a bit about me and myself and how I look at future studies. That's where a futurist knows something. Then I'll go on and talk very briefly on the technological basis for big data, briefly because I'm absolutely an amateur in this respect. Moving on to selected consequences, and again I stress select because there are many others, arriving at some conclusions. But to start with me, I'm a futurist, so-called, and I research the future, which is problematical because you basically can't predict. Because basically we all know that the future is something which we do as we produce, as we go along. On the other hand, you can't help trying because of the sad but true fact that decisions have to be made in the present. Would be lovely if we could make some decisions in the past. I have at least various things I'd like to get fixed, but that's not possible. We're always stuck at this lousy present when we make our decisions. And they have to work at that kind of future which is so badly documented. Therefore, we do have to have some conscious expectations on what kind of future we think we are going to live in when it arrives. A guess is better than nothing, because if you've guessed, then you can see what you've been wrong. So you can't predict, but you can't help trying. And I have been trying since 1976 to admit the embarrassing fact that I, for 36 years now, have been doing the same thing. Other people's are more movable. Big data, there are many definitions. I like the best the three V's, that the big data is characterized by an increase in the amount of data, an increase in the speed it arrives, and an increase in the range of data and data sources. They are all galloping upwards increasingly. And the technological basis is, of course, that there are more and more technologies which can harvest data. We have sensor technology, we have cameras, we have software logs, microphones, RFIDs, wireless sensors, networks. And I mean, only the imagination puts limits of what you can imagine in the future of devices that could produce information and deliver it and send it. Some expect that in 2020 we will have 50 billion devices. A couple of years ago, the expectation was that there would be 25 billion devices in 2020, so you can see even the estimate of the amount of things emitting information is also increasing by the time. And they are increasing the communicating not only to people, but also with themselves. So therefore we are talking about the Internet of Things, and we will end up with more and more automated communication, sending a communication, receiving it, processing and acting on it. In the end, but it won't be in my time, humans will become superfluous. We have totally the automated communications and people can shut up, which would be progress. One way of looking at it is, as Stanford Research Institute put it, we started back in 2000 with RFIDs, which facilitated routing and inventory. Then we went on to a more vertical market appliances with cost reductions. And we will go on to ubiquitous positioning where you can know where everything is. And in the end, we will have a physical world web where we will be able to see and talk to whatever. I've tried video conferencing, which is just a small way of being able to communicate with everybody on everything, always, without moving. I think it's one of the most fascinating technologies. One consequence is, of course, within marketing, because if consumers allow shops, retailers, to amass more and more information on them, then there is a quid pro quo, because the more a retailer knows about his customer, the more he is able to tailor his offerings, which is good for both the retailer, because then he will be more sure of having a say, and the customer is also advantages, because then he will not get all other different kinds of offers that he's not interested in. So in many ways, as long as it is misused, it's a win-win situation where you can have retailers which in the future will be able to be slightly mafia-like and saying, we have an offer you can't refuse because we know precisely how you are, we know precisely your preferences, and we can therefore direct our messages directly to your tasters, which is great. Because basically, it's, if you buy more, you get more relevant publicity offers, you have publicity offers which are non-interrupted. Because if the retailer knows enough about his consumer, based on these big data, then he will be able to contact the consumer at a moment where he knows the consumer is ripe. Or better even, ensure the feeling at the consumer that he's drawing the offer instead of getting it pushed into his face. And furthermore, with geosocial reality, he will also be able to contact the consumer where he is and where it's most appropriate. And just imagine what it would be when we have digitalized taste and smell. You can walk down the street, and when you come to a bakery, they will send a message of fresh baked bread that you won't be able to say no to. So I think in many ways it's a win-win situation with big data within retail, as long as a retailer doesn't misuse it or sells it to somebody who will misuse it. I once knew a guy who was a director of a credit card company. He said the credit card operations, they were sort of middling, but he said, I have an index of one of the best payers, and that's worth something. That's just the beginning of what big data can be used for. Another consequence is in value chain management, the more we have big data and the more we know to interpret this important point, then the more we will be able to have a total knowledge of all the steps in the value chains. We will have a sort of transparency in how things work, which is great. Take, for instance, within food production. When we know that 50% of all food produced is lost in a world where people still go hungry, it's worth to do something about it. So the more you, through the various devices, can follow the food through the value chain, the more you can precisely say, here it gets lost. I witnessed an entrepreneur last year in a competition for entrepreneurship who had developed a system with plastic balls which inside had a sensor and a transmitter. And he could then place these balls around in a big grain storage so they could continually send messages on the state of humidity and that kind of thing, so thereby diminishing the risk of losing the grain and the foodstuffs. So ultimately, I could say that if you really use big data with all these transmitters, you could come to the ultimate totally lean situation where you only start production when you know there is a need. Because the more transparent it is, the more the value chain is transparent, the more you know in time when something is needed. So you don't have to produce to stock, you will increasingly have to produce to direct consumption. On the personal level, you can also speculate on some of the consequences of big data. First of all, already today you can, when you are out jogging, you can record your heartbeat and whatever, and when you're not running and so on. So ultimately, you will be able to continuously to record your life. And some narcissists think that's great. And once this becomes common, you have your whole life on storage. So it's no problem writing your memoirs in the future. It's nearly automated. Have a look at my memoirs. And look at how the challenge can be when boy meets girl. Huh? Are you willing to show your life? It's not always very pretty. So it can really be a question of trust to the partner if you really sort of open up not only your mind, but your data. Of course, where we have been talking most on the problematical side of big data is the question of control. Because the more devices we have that are recording where you are, the more people know of who you are, where you are. So we are going from, we know where you live as they say in the gangs, to we know where you are, whenever. I mean, they're already now experimenting in, I think, in California, by injecting a chip at the old people, in the old people's home. So if they are too threatened by dementia, they can be left to walk around. And then by lunchtime, they say, well, we have to eat. Ah, there you are. They can find them. Huh? So that's just the beginning. And just imagine you could get something like that on your kids. Wouldn't it be lovely to know where your kids are? Huh? Or where your wife? Huh? So, I mean, there's lots of interesting consequences control-wise. And therefore, with all these data, if I were the police, I would really put extra energy into developing software that can manipulate and can process these enormous amounts of data in order to find the criminal side of it. Because we have to realize, and it's a quote, and I forgot who said it, that privacy is gone. Get over it. The only question we have is, will it be Big Brother, which is not nice, or will it be Big Mother using all these data in order to take care of and ensure that we don't do anything wrong? You can also work on the philosophical side. Chris Anderson of the magazine Wired has speculated that there will be so many data, and then they sort of can assemble and make sense by themselves. As long as we haven't really developed artificial intelligence far enough, I doubt that. But his point is, you don't have a theory in order to ask questions to the data. The data will sort of produce their answers by themselves. I'm rather skeptical on that, but I mean, it's an interesting thing. But I still am old-fashioned. You still have to know something about the area on which you have extreme amount of data in order to put the right questions and then see what kind of answers you can get of it. But ultimately, with high-level artificial intelligence, Chris Anderson may be right. So some conclusions could be, first of all, big data, it's a mega trend. And futurists define megatrends as something which is pervasive, which influences everything. And I do think that big data is going to be ubiquitous in its consequence, will affect everything, people, things, production, whatever. On one condition, and that is that we will have developed the software. And at the same time, we have to remember that big data is a good example of what we have many examples of, that we human beings, we tend to overestimate what can happen in the short term and underestimate what can happen in the long term. And in the long term, which as a futurist think is most interesting, there will be huge consequences. If we are able to manage these data, because today it's the fact that the output of data increases much faster than the ability to interpret them. So more research is needed. That's the standard conclusion of every researcher, meaning more money, more research money is needed. But I do think that this is the bottleneck in the development of big data, the ability to harvest and make sense of enormous mass of data. And then we have always to remember that trust is essential, because we are increasingly being observed. And therefore, we have to trust that those who observe us, those who got our data, they don't misuse it. So trust is absolutely fundamental. We have to remember that trust takes time to build, but a second to vanish once you realize it has been misused. So this is one basic precondition. And therefore, it is another example of many technologies that they always have their Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. They have their good side and their bad side. If you remember the old story about Robert Louis Stevenson about the nice doctor who, because he ingested some things, he in the night turned into a monster. That's the same way with technology. This concludes my talk on big data so far. Here are some small data should you want to continue the discussion, because I think there are lots of things to debate on this subject of big data. You can do it by using these small data. Thank you very much for your attention.